A Redditor by the name of Intoxite asked this question in the subreddit to TaskReddit this question. People of Reddit who have found dead bodies, what was your immediate reaction? Here is some answers. Redditor Colorm2 found my mom's body. I was 9. I thought she was sleeping. I understood when my sisters started crying. Redditor Mobile Paint 7535 So when I was about 15 I went to school to take my final exam. I was late due to my bus being in traffic and had to walk through a few streets after getting to my stop. At around midway there, this guy crossing the street gets hit by a car going 50 in a school zone. The primary school was to the side of my school. He went over the car and fell on the ground with a crack. Car drives away. At that point I went to check it out and was already panicking. He was still breathing for a while after the crash for about 5 minutes and then he just died. I called 112 and tried to explain the situation as I was hyperventilating. Apparently he had broken his spine and had a lot of internal bleeding. I did not do the exam. Redditor Thunder Vegas. I was watching a movie with my girlfriend, and suddenly heard a loud crash. I used to be trained in first aid and CPR, so I jumped up and walked outside to try to see if there was anything I could do. I wasn't the first on the scene, but I was the first to check out if the driver was okay. I noticed that the glass on the windshield was cracked at about head high, and no seat belt was worn, nor were the airbags deployed. Nothing felt right, and there was a feeling of dread that I can only describe as empty with a side of heavy. The man was slouched over to his right, appeared to be about late 50s early 60s, and the primary thing I noticed that confused me was that his veins in his arms looked as though he was still flexing. There was nothing I could do, as there was no pulse, no breathing, and a clear traumatic brain injury that even had he been alive, it wouldn't have looked great long term. Redditor Brief Dragon Fruit called 911 both times. Once for my boyfriend who relapsed and died in our basement. I didn't understand addiction at the time. Once for my brother last May who took his own life. I found him by looking through a window in his apartment. The worst day of my life. Redditor Emily Christine 9. I have a story. I didn't physically see him, but I smelled the body. I worked at a 55-plus independent apartment living community. It is not assisted living but rather for active adults. When I first started, I was told about a resident named Charles. He was a diagnosed paranoid schizophrenic with many health problems and did not take care of himself. He absolutely should not have been there but rather an assisted living facility. However, we cannot do anything about it. I first met Charles when I had to go to his apartment for him to sign some paperwork regarding his lease. His apartment reeked of old food and human waste. There was garbage on the floor, you couldn't see the countertops due to all of the junk, and the vinyl was sticky when you walked on it. It was so frustrating to see. He had caregivers but would constantly fire them after a few sessions because he began to think they were poisoning his food, scamming him, etc. So he would lock them out and not let them in. Fast forward a few months and I began to form some sort of bond with him because I constantly had to call him to remind him of rent, and when I could come up to his apartment to pick it up, he was the only one who physically did not leave his apartment for at least 2 years and I would have to pick up his check from him. He was an incredibly stubborn and rude man who you could not get through to him. But I saw him as a vulnerable, lonely man who had no friends or family and needed help. It was time for him to sign his lease renewal, so I called to ask if I could come to his apartment to have him sign it. I walked in and had to go to his bedroom where he spent his entire remaining years in his hospital bed watching TV and ordering junk from infomercials. There was trash everywhere and human feces near the bathroom. I crouched by his bed as he signed his lease and he began to tell me he used to be a chef and misses the ability to cook. I listened to him and let him talk because I know it must have been years since he had an actual heartfelt conversation with a human. I remember feeling in awe that he wasn't being an asshole, and at one point I saw him smile. I left, and a few weeks later he called down to the office to ask a question. He usually would call to gripe and then hang up. But when I answered, he asked if it was me, asked for my name, and asked how I was doing. I put a smile on my face because I was genuinely shocked he took the time to ask a simple question like that, because it was normally not like him. We chatted for a tiny bit and he ended it with "Happy Holidays." Fast forward a month and I have to make his rent payment call. He didn't answer, so I left a voicemail. He didn't return the call, which was unusual because he literally just lays in bed all day, so I thought it was odd he didn't see the message on his phone. For a few days I kept calling, and at this point rent was past due. I believe my last voicemail to him I said I was worried about him. I had told my boss what was going on, and keep in mind this was a new boss and she had only started about 2 months prior and did not know much about Charles. She was concerned, so he decided to just go up to his apartment to knock. This is where I can say my life honestly changed. The moment I stepped foot outside the elevator and walked to his apartment, I stopped dead in my tracks and felt the blood rush from my face. I looked at my boss and said, "I smell something." I almost had a panic attack and began pounding on his door to no answer. His apartment was at the end of the hallway in a corner, so no one had passed his apartment and could not smell anything. I immediately called 911 for a wellness check, and when the fire department got there I went up with them and gave them the rundown. They were familiar with Charles because he had called 911 in the past and they knew he did not take care of himself. I remember unlocking the door for them, and as soon as they opened the door it was like a flood of putrid and energy came rushing out. This was during the time where we had to wear masks, so luckily I had one on or I would have lost my lunch. I had never smelled a decomposed body before, and people who have are right, it's so bad it's indescribable. I remember being somewhat in denial, but as the fire department walked in they turned and stopped, and looked down at the floor where I couldn't see. One of the firemen came out, slowly closed the door behind him and locked eyes with me and shook his head. I immediately bawled. I felt so guilty for not knowing or getting him help sooner. I called my boss downstairs and sobbed, saying Charles is dead. I remember not even taking the elevator down, but just running down the hall and down the stairs. By the time I was on the first floor and running to the office, I was still sobbing and ran into my maintenance supervisor. He immediately asked what was wrong, and I again said Charles is dead. We knew this day would come, and we knew it was going to be a hell of a unit turn due to the damage. I collapsed in my boss's office crying, and one of the firemen came down and asked for his file to see if there was an emergency contact. His ex-wife happened to be that, so over the days we had to contact her, and get with our attorney to make sure we were doing the correct steps as she was next of kin. I remember the fireman looking at me and saying that we knew he was not taking care of himself, such as taking his insulin and medications, and this was bound to happen unfortunately. He told me he most likely was walking to the bathroom, got dizzy, and collapsed on the hall floor and did not wake up. He said his body was there for at least a week. I remember feeling so guilty and wondering what his last thoughts were. Was he thinking of me? Why would I be selfish and wonder that? My boss told me the only reason why we found him was because the sweet downstairs assistant was the last and only one to truly care about him. That stuck with me. His last few months, he was finally given a glimpse of normality by talking to me on the phone and of me going to his apartment for human interaction. It was my first encounter dealing with death physically so close, so seeing the process was surreal, especially seeing him wheeled out in a black bag on a gurney. I'm grateful I did not physically see him dead, and will only remember seeing him smile for the first and last time, knowing I finally got through to him. I hope he finally is at peace. Redditor. Troubles Muse. As a nurse aide in a nursing home that happened more than I'd like to remember, and tearing up was always my immediate reaction. Redditor. DJJRRR. Was beside my mum's bed when she died. I just somehow knew it was close, so I stayed there and waited. After her last breath, I just sat by her for a bit, thinking she was now in peace and past the pain and struggle of a body that was progressively shutting down from old age. Called out for the nurse to come in and confirm she was gone. My dad, I found on the floor at our old family home a couple of days too late, almost 5 years later. Called my wife and then the authorities and sat on the front step feeling guilty, a bit lost and finally annoyed. I was angry and frustrated that he always point-blank refused to have one of those medical alert pendants and I hadn't been there over the weekend. I'm still dealing with the remnants of that 15 months later. Redditor. Polyontimer. About 20 years ago, I was walking down the street in Brazil. A 30-something bicyclist was coming down the street, shirt in his hand, wearing shorts and flip-flops. A large open-bed truck with a full load came down the road in the same direction. The truck caught up to the bike right in front of me. The bicyclist went out of sight, then I saw him for a moment as the cab of the truck passed him. The bike then fell over, toward and under the truck bed. I yelled, "No, no, no." The rear dual tires went over the poor man, and the truck just kept going. I immediately started chasing the truck, flagging it down. It stopped about half a block later. The driver asked what the issue was. "You ran over a guy back there." He got out of the cab, took off his hat, and held it over his chest. He then walked into a bar. I ran to the bar employee who was standing at the door, and asked him to call someone. I waited for a few hours. An ambulance showed up, and left. Then police showed up, and then a vehicle to collect the body. I felt that I should stay to say that the bike fell over, and the truck wasn't speeding or swerving. I don't think there were any other eyewitnesses. The police did not want to take my statement. I insisted and told my account. I don't think he wrote any of it down. After it was over, I just wanted to go home and lay down. Redditor. Crunchisuds. I found my granddad's body about a day after he passed away. The first thing I thought was he looked so small. We suspected the end was nearing, so it wasn't really a shock. He lived in a flat in our backyard and we visited and interacted every single day. He was getting old and was a 2-pack-a-day smoker, so we knew his time was coming. He was about 5'11", so not a short guy and a bit overweight. When he was alive I always felt safe near him because to me, a small female, he seemed so large but gentle. When I found his body he felt so much smaller. I don't really know why, but it seemed like something was missing from him. Almost as if his personality made up a large portion of his physical size. This was 2 years ago now and I still think of him every day. The fact that he was smaller after he passed away is morbid but weirdly comforting. It made me realize that most of him was his personality and his intelligence, not his physical body.